Hello and welcome to NABA Perspectives, where we look at key issues, trends, and stories that are driving economy, policy, and business across Africa. I'm Lanre, the head of content at the Norwegian-African Business Association, or NABA, and today we're talking about Africa's return to the capital markets. That's right. African sovereigns have returned to the international capital markets. In case you weren't aware, the last time an African sovereign issued debt in hard currency, i.e., the dollar, basically, was in April 2022. So we've gone almost 2 years without a single African sovereign issuing any hard currency debt. Why has that been the case? In short, we kind of all know the story. We've had really tight financial conditions. There's been concerns about debt distress across Africa. Now, in early 2024, market conditions are easing. US rate cuts are on the horizon, and that is once again opening up the door. In the last couple of weeks, we have had a flurry of activity. First, we saw Côte d'Ivoire sell $2.6 billion worth of debt. Then earlier this week, Benin issued its first US dollar denominated bond. It sold $750 million worth of debt. And hot off the press, so to speak, just the other day, I think it was Wednesday, Kenya's government announced that it too was returning to the capital markets to sell US dollar denominated debt. Now, on the surface, this is good news. Africa has been locked out from accessing capital markets. It's been locked out from raising the kind of money that African economies need to support economic growth, to drive investment. Now we're seeing things open up again. On the surface, in principle, this is a good thing. However, we need to be a little bit careful about this. First, we're still in the middle of a debt crisis. Let's not forget that. Now, a lot of discussion around this kind of beats around the bush and is a bit polite around this term of calling it a debt crisis. I would say a situation in which you have, I think it's almost 24 countries, according to the IMF, across Africa that are now at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress, where you've had 3 high-profile sovereign defaults in the last 3 or 4 years. You had Zambia in 2020. Then you had Ghana at the end of 2022. And of course, just a couple of months ago, we had Ethiopia also default on its external debt. All 3 of those countries are now trying to get debt relief under the so-called G20 Common Framework, which is, of course, aimed at helping these countries to restructure their debt. That process is proving to be very difficult indeed. Zambia has now been at it for over 3 years. And there's been many occasions when it seemed like they were getting close to reaching a deal with their official and private creditors, but we're still not there. Ghana and Ethiopia are now entering that process, and their experience is unlikely to be much different. There are concerns globally around the inadequacy of the common framework to meet the debt distress needs and the debt relief needs of many emerging economies, many of them in Africa, who are struggling with their debt service payments in particular. So yes, it's good that we're seeing capital markets open up again, but let's not lose perspective here and forget that there is still a significant problem on the continent. There are a lot of countries that I would say are at risk of still defaulting. I wouldn't be surprised if we see at least a couple of more sovereign defaults before things get better. And there are many countries that are very much on the edge. So that's one thing that we have to take into consideration. Also, we need to be careful about how this is often presented in the media. And for this, I think the example of Benin is a really good one. Let me just get the tab up here. Here we go. Right. Here we go. So here you'll see this is a Bloomberg article, and the headline says it all. Benin's debut dollar bonds oversubscribed by more than 6 times, right? what a blockbuster entry to the capital markets for little Benin. Benin's debut dollar bond offering was oversubscribed by more than 6 times as demand for riskier emerging market assets grows amid expectations of US interest rate cuts this year. Well, first thing to say, I guess, is well done to Benin for its successful issuance. Nothing against Benin, but treat headlines like this with care. First of all, there's a reason that African sovereign bonds tend to be oversubscribed. This isn't the first time I've seen headlines like this. I've seen many of them. And the main reason is that they pay much higher yields than bonds in so-called developed economies, right? That is just financial jargon for basically the interest that you earn as an investor if you buy into these bonds. And in financial terms, it's just a no-brainer, right? Do you want more money or do you want less money? So the interest is it's linked to these high yields that you tend to get for African bonds. And those high yields are part of the problem that got us to where we are in terms of the debt crisis I've just been talking about. Because high yields mean you need to pay higher interest. And when you have a situation like we've had in the last couple of years where the dollar has been really strong, interest rates have been going up, many African currencies have depreciated against the dollar, that debt can very quickly become unsustainable. And to illustrate the point here around why such headlines need to be treated with care, here is an article from not too long ago. There we go. This is from 2020, and it reads almost exactly the same. Ghana sells $3 billion in Eurobonds, oversubscribed 5 times. So the same kind of enthusiasm for this, implying, isn't this great? Isn't this just fantastic and wonderful? Now, this is February 2020. 2.5 years, or a little bit more than 2.5 years later, Ghana defaulted on that debt. So treat the coverage of this with some skepticism. Yes, because having a successful bond issuance doesn't mean that it's going to work out fine down the line. And if there are concerns about the ability to pay the yields that are expected, or the yields at which you sell these bonds, then you might run into trouble, as has been the case with Ghana. The other thing to say is that market conditions are not guaranteed. Yes, in early 2024, we're seeing some easing of market conditions. As I said earlier, rate cuts are on the horizon by the US Federal Reserve. But, just rewind a few years and think about the volatility that we've been through. The point being that global economic conditions are unpredictable. And I would say that given the current state of world affairs, the current state of the global economy, not to mention the potential for conflict and insecurity that we're all well aware of, I would be mindful of betting too much and banking on market conditions continuing to improve, or remaining or staying, or being stable, or being conducive to issuing these bonds for any amount of time. I mean, who would have thought in 2019 that we would have a global pandemic, that we would have a major war in Europe, that we would now be looking at an escalating conflict in the Middle East? All of these shocks, have come in a short span. And I would say that in this respect, it's probably best to err on the side of caution. Yeah. So things may well very quickly get worse again. And then, we might once again find ourselves in a situation where, overzealous bond issuances can backfire on some of these countries. Now, let's also not forget that on the same theme of the unpredictability of where things are going. So Benin and Côte d'Ivoire, at the moment, according to the IMF, they are considered to be at moderate risk of debt distress, which is good for them. They're not in the high risk club, which is not a place that you want to be. But let's take Kenya as an example. Back in 2018, Kenya was considered to be at low risk of debt distress. Then it was upgraded to moderate. In 2020, it was upgraded to high risk of debt distress by the IMF. And I would say that Kenya is still in a precarious position at the moment. And seeing it go back to the capital markets is, I'm sure they know what they're doing, but it's something that has to be treated with care. Now, to end this and to kind of hammer home that point around just having to be careful with this, there are a couple of quotes that I always bear in mind when it comes to the issue of debt in Africa, and especially the selling of US dollar denominated debt by African sovereigns. One is from the president of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina, and this is from 2019. Oh, just a second. There we go. This is from 2019, where the president states emphatically, so September 2019, where he states emphatically, Africa has absolutely no debt crisis. That's just before COVID. And of course, a couple of years later, the war in Ukraine, and we know the story ever since then. The other quote is from the former president of the World Bank, Jim Kim. And this is in 2019. There we go. All right. There we go. This is March 2017, actually. And this is when the former World Bank president was on a visit to Tanzania. And there he too stated emphatically that one of the things we will never go back to is the bad old days where countries were in debt distress. I would say that neither of those comments has aged particularly well. Not that they could predict the future, but it just underlines the point that we need to be careful here. Now, overall, end where we began, rather. In principle, this is, of course, good news. The African governments aren't doing anything sort of wrong by selling US dollar denominated debt. We all know the world runs on debt. Now, we can have a debate about some of the problematics that come with that, and I think there are issues with that, but this isn't some sort of out of the norm behavior. This is how governments all around the world raise money. The question is, and this will be the test of this return to the capital markets that we're seeing, and I would anticipate that as soon as other countries are able to tap those markets, they will. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more debt being sold later this year by other African sovereigns. The issue is, have lessons been learned from the last few years? I remember it was in around 2008, 2009, Ghana kicked off the Eurobond spree across Africa. It was the first sovereign in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa, to issue a Eurobond. And then from there, it just cascaded. And we saw more and more countries get on that bandwagon. And for a time, it looked like it was going pretty well. But then it all came unstuck. And my concern here is that if care isn't taken, and given the delicate financial positions that many African governments are in right now, if care isn't taken, this could easily backfire. I don't want to come across as some sort of doomsayer, but past experience is something that must be learned from. And my hope is that as we enter this new phase of borrowing on the international capital markets by African sovereigns, that those lessons have been taken on board. We shall see. Anyway, that concludes my rant for this edition of the NABA Perspectives podcast. If you like it, feel free to subscribe to our channel. Thank you very much for watching. We will be back next week.